The year is 2026. You're sitting in a war room deep inside the Pentagon. The lights hum. A massive map of the Arctic glows in front of you. Greenland pulses like a prize. Generals are nodding. Wall Street is grinning. A congressman from Georgia just said the quiet part out loud. Let's just buy it. You want to laugh, but no one in the room is joking. This isn't just speculation anymore. It's being actively discussed in policy circles. And as someone who used to run logistics models for the U.S. defense complex, let me tell you, there's a difference between moving cargo and moving into someone else's country. Spoiler alert, when a superpower tries to purchase territory, whose people have already said, we're not for sale, things don't go smoothly. They fracture, not just alliances, but the illusion of moral authority that's held them together. Hey, I'm Kamran. Welcome back to World Collapse Chronicles, where we don't sugarcoat power. Let's rewind. It's 2019. Donald Trump floats the idea of buying Greenland. Everyone laughs. Denmark calls it absurd. The media treats it like a fever dream from a man who probably thinks risk is a real-world planning tool. Cut to 2024. Trump's back in office. And this time, it's not a joke. It's legislation. Drafts are floating around Capitol Hill titled, no irony here, Make Greenland Great Again. Subtle, never heard of her. And here is the kicker. According to reports from the Fulcrum on February 10, 2025, Representative Buddy Carter introduced a bill proposing an entirely new name for the island. Red, White, and Blue Land. I'm not making this up. You couldn't write this as satire. It would get rejected for being too on the nose. But peel back the circus music, and what you find is dead serious. According to the Financial Times, Greenland's mineral reserves are worth up to $1.1 trillion, mostly rare earths, the backbone of AI, missiles, EVs, and whatever next-generation Cold War we're cooking up. Greenland has 56,000 people. That's fewer than my hometown of Tacoma. But it sits on a landmass larger than Mexico. So here's the trillion-dollar question. Is this the greatest real estate deal of the century, or the opening move in a geopolitical deal that could fracture NATO and permanently damage America's credibility? In the next 30 minutes, we're going to dissect 6 brutal truths about what's really at stake if the U.S. goes forward with this purchase. Grab your coffee, maybe your passport. Let's dive in. 1. The moment NATO started to crack, but no one noticed. Let me tell you, something people in suits don't like admitting. NATO is not just a military alliance, it's a trust fund. After World War II, Europe made a devil's bargain. It went something like this. We'll put down the nukes, we'll mothball the tanks, we'll stop pretending we're empires. Just keep us safe. And don't ever, ever turn that protection into pressure. That protection came with a brand name, the United States. And the umbrella? NATO. I worked near that umbrella. I saw what it covered, and more importantly, what it threatened to expose when it folds. Because here's the rule no one writes down in treaties. In alliance politics, credibility depends on the protector not becoming a threat to protected parties. And yet, here we are. The moment the United States tries to purchase Greenland, no matter how many ribbons or handshakes we wrap it in, we're not just making an offer. We're putting a NATO ally, Denmark, in our crosshairs. Think about the absurdity. The country that built NATO suddenly becomes its biggest liability. Article 5, the sacred Attack One, Attack All clause, goes up in smoke. Who defends whom when the attacker is the umbrella? Danish officials have expressed concerns that such actions could undermine alliance trust. Multiple European analysts have suggested this could create precedent concerns among smaller NATO members. Because if Washington can undermine Danish sovereignty today, what stops it from doing the same to Estonia, or Latvia, or Norway? And when the trust breaks, Europe reverts to muscle memory, rearmament, remilitarization, maybe even nukes. France, Germany, Poland, the very nations that spent decades dismantling their war machines, start building them back. Not because they want to, but because they no longer have a choice. That's not a collapse. That's a slow-motion unraveling, a brick-by-brick demolition of the Western order from the inside. And here's the kicker. This doesn't happen with tanks. It happens with money. Denmark and the Nordics control trillions in sovereign wealth and pension funds. When trust dies, so does capital. Investors flee, confidence evaporates. And suddenly, NATO isn't a shield. It's a hollow acronym echoing across empty boardrooms. Because the day America plants a flag on Greenland, it stops being a leader of allies and starts looking a lot like an empire collecting provinces. Question for you. If you were in Vilnius or Warsaw or even Berlin, would you still trust America to protect you after it just took your neighbor's territory? Let me know in the comments. I want to see how deep this trust really goes. 2. The $1.1 trillion mirage. Let me confess something. Every time I hear politicians say $1.1 trillion, my brain doesn't see treasure. It sees a spreadsheet. Back when I worked in defense logistics, my job was to kill fantasies with numbers. You can draw anything you want on a map. But if the cash flow doesn't survive contact with reality, the project is already dead. And Greenland? Greenland is a perfect example of what I call a paper empire. Yes, the rocks under the ice might be worth $1.1 trillion. But minerals in the ground are not money. Money only exists when something can be dug, processed, insured, shipped, and sold. Between those 2 points is a corridor of death. First problem, most of that stuff can't be mined profitably. Rare earths don't show up in neat little gold veins. They're usually scattered, low-grade, contaminated, and mixed with radioactive junk like thorium. That means you don't just dig, you build a toxic waste nightmare. One dip in global prices, one spike in energy costs, and that trillion-dollar deposit turns into a hole that eats billions. I've seen this movie before. Projects don't fail because there's no resource. They fail because the math stops working. Second problem, mines aren't approved by engineers. They're approved by people. Greenland isn't empty land. It's a small, fragile society with long memories of being used by outsiders. Every serious mine needs a social license. From the autonomous government, from Inuit communities, from environmental groups. One bad referendum, one wave of protests, one lawsuit that drags on for years. In mining finance, every year of delay burns hundreds of millions just in interest and upkeep. You don't need activists to kill a project. Time will do it for them. Third problem, the real money isn't in the rock. It's in the refinery. Rare earths are only valuable once they're separated, purified, and turned into industrial-grade materials. That's where China makes its money. Not in the ground, but in the processing. If the US owns Greenland, but not the refining chain, congratulations. You're selling raw material for thin margins, while the toxic waste and environmental liabilities stay on your side of the ocean. Owning the land does not mean owning the value. And then there's the most dangerous variable of all, the buyer. No bank finances a multi-billion-dollar mine without guaranteed customers. But magnet makers, battery firms, and defense contractors hate one thing above all else: geopolitical risk. The moment Greenland becomes a sovereignty dispute, it gets stamped with a toxic label: unstable. Once that happens, interest rates explode, insurance premiums spike, investors demand insane returns to compensate for risk. And suddenly, that trillion-dollar dream collapses into a negative value nightmare. This is the Greenland paradox. A takeover creates headlines, but destroys the one thing mining needs to live: stability. You can plant the flag. You can rename the island. But if the cash flow can't survive the politics, you don't own a treasure. You own a very expensive hole in the ice. When I look at Greenland, I don't see El Dorado. I see a balance sheet where every cost is real, and every profit is a question mark. And in the real world, projects don't die in explosions. They die quietly, when no one dares to write the next check. So tell me, if this were your money, would you invest in a mine trapped between melting ice, political chaos, and social revolt? 3. Greenland is melting, and it's coming for you. Let me take you somewhere most policymakers won't go, not because it's forbidden, but because it's inconvenient. Greenland is melting, and I don't mean climate headlines or abstract carbon charts. I mean the physical ground is falling apart, literally. September 2023, East Greenland, Dixon Fjord. A chunk of land the size of a mid-sized city collapses into the ocean, 25 million cubic meters. The resulting tsunami is over 200 meters high, taller than the Statue of Liberty. The shock is so powerful, it triggers a seismic signal that echoes for 9 days straight. And this isn't science fiction, this is data. Why did it happen? Because the ice is gone, the permafrost is melting, and the mountains that were once glued together by frozen earth are coming undone. Greenland is not thawing, it is crumbling. Every mining project, every military base, every pipeline, all of it is now sitting on a foundation you can't trust. You can draft all the engineering reports you want, but no one builds strategy on a landslide. And that's just the start. Because in the real world, no mega project gets built without one thing: insurance. You need reinsurers to back your risk, and reinsurers only write checks for things they can predict. Greenland is becoming unpredictable, fast. And once the models break, the money follows. No insurance, no capital, no construction. That shiny new mine, that Arctic radar base, that precious supply chain the Pentagon dreams about, all of it collapses into a financial black hole. Even the military side is breaking down. The US wants Greenland for surveillance, long-range bombers, early warning radars. But every one of those sits on melting ground. Permafrost is the enemy now, and Washington will soon be pouring billions just to keep its Arctic footprint from sinking, not expanding, surviving. And supply chains? Forget it. Greenland's entire export logistics depend on tight shipping seasons. But storms are getting worse. Ice is forming late or melting early. Ships miss windows. Deliveries stall. And companies walk away. Because in modern economics, if you can't guarantee arrival, you don't exist. You are a ghost supplier with no clients. So let me break the illusion. Greenland is not the next great frontier. It is the next great sinkhole, a place too unstable to build, too risky to insure, too chaotic to price. Pension funds know it. Sovereign wealth funds know it. Wall Street knows it. No one wants to bankroll a dream melting from the inside out. And here's the final twist. The hotter it gets, the more valuable Greenland seems, on paper. But the hotter it gets, the less buildable, less livable, and less fundable it becomes. Greenland is not surrendering. It is fighting back, not with soldiers, with physics, with weather, with time. And it does not care how strategic you think it is. So if you are still picturing Greenland as America's Arctic jackpot, let me offer you a different image, a cold, crumbling island, a $1 trillion fantasy, and one very expensive regret. 4. The deal that breaks everyone involved. Here's something I've learned the hard way. In geopolitics, the real bombs are not dropped from planes. They're signed in contracts, filed in trade courts, priced in basis points on a spreadsheet most people will never see. And when I look at Greenland, I don't see a territory, I see a fuse. Right now, Greenland lives inside Europe's economic bloodstream. It's technically part of the Kingdom of Denmark, which gives it near seamless access to the European Union. 90% of Greenland's exports go straight to the EU, mostly seafood, shrimp, halibut, cold water gold. But here's the twist. The second Greenland becomes American territory, that trade lifeline gets severed. Instantly. No sanctions, no drama, just paperwork. The fish become American goods. That means World Trade Organization rules. That means tariffs, quotas, and inspections so strict they can sink a small fleet in red tape. And it doesn't stop there. Europe doesn't need to slap America in the face. It just quietly closes the door. Environmental certifications, legal origin audits, procurement rules. Every loophole becomes a wall, and Greenland's only export engine stalls, permanently. But here's the kicker. While Greenland chokes, America bleeds, and not in the headlines, in the bond markets. Because this isn't the Cold War. Power today lives in credit ratings and borrowing costs. The second the United States tries to annex land from a NATO ally, rating agencies light up. Treaties are violated, markets get jittery, and jittery markets punish you in the most American way possible. They raise your interest rates. Even a tiny downgrade on U.S. sovereign credit means billions more in annual debt payments. Trillions in public debt suddenly cost more to roll over. Greenland doesn't have to bankrupt America. It just needs to make money more expensive. And Europe? Oh, it plays the long game. The central banks don't need to dump U.S. treasuries in a rage. They just stop buying, quietly shift into euros, or gold, or Swiss bonds. That's how empires lose reserve status, not with bangs, but with a shrug. This is the paradox I can't stop thinking about. The U.S. is not buying an opportunity. It is adopting a dependency, an economy locked out of its primary market, a territory with no revenue engine, and someone has to keep the lights on. That someone is you, the American taxpayer, who now gets to fund hospitals, schools, export subsidies, infrastructure, social programs, and more for an island most people couldn't find on a map. Because once it's U.S. territory, it is no longer optional. It's constitutional. This is not a real estate deal. It's a slow-motion financial trap, one where America assumes every risk, and the rest of the world simply follows the rules and watches it unravel. And what scares me most is this. Somewhere along the line, we stopped understanding the difference between owning something and controlling it, between control and prosperity. We think signing a check means shaping a future, but Greenland's future isn't for sale. It is shaped by trust, by relationships, by systems it already belongs to. And ripping it out of that fabric just to plant a bigger flag isn't strategy. It's vandalism, and you're the one footing the bill. 5. Buying a ghost, not a gold mine. Let me be brutally honest with you. When politicians talk about Greenland, they talk like they are buying a slot machine that spits out money forever, like Alaska in the old days. A frontier, a jackpot? That is not what this is. What they are really buying is a fragile economy on life support. I have spent enough years staring at balance sheets to know the smell of a dying system. Greenland has it. Growth is flat. The workforce is shrinking. The treasury is thin. The state runs not on taxes, but on transfers from Denmark. Almost half of the entire public budget comes from Copenhagen. Not investment, not development, life support. This is not a young frontier waiting to explode with opportunity. This is a crisis town frozen in ice. And here is the part no one tells you. When the United States takes Greenland, it does not just take land, it inherits the bill. Hospitals, schools, pensions, roads, airports, power grids, welfare, all of it becomes Washington's problem. Not politically, legally. Because the moment Greenland enters the American constitutional system, its people gain the right to demand federal standards. If the hospitals fail, they sue. If the schools fall behind, they sue. If the runway cracks, FEMA shows up with a check. There is no walkaway clause, no bankruptcy court, no cut your losses option. We have already lived this movie. It is called Puerto Rico. 3 million people. A century under U.S. control. Hundreds of billions in bailouts and debt restructuring. Still stuck, still dependent, still treated like second-class citizens. Now imagine that model applied to a place colder, farther, and more expensive per person to run. Greenland would not be an asset. It would be a frozen Puerto Rico. And unlike a real investment, a territory does not expire. You cannot sell it when it turns sour. You cannot shut it down when the numbers go red. It becomes a permanent line in the federal budget, a liability with no end date. That is the core of this deal. The United States is not buying a mine. It is buying an obligation. And obligations are what kill empires. When I look at Greenland, I do not think about strategy. I do not think about flags or minerals. I think about invoices. Because no empire collapses from not having enough land. It collapses from having too many mouths to feed. Greenland might be far away, but the bill will land right in your mailbox. So let me ask you something personal. Are you willing to pay for the rest of your life for a place you may never even see? 6. From one master to another. I've lived long enough to know that behind every grand strategy, there's someone small getting crushed. And here's the part most analysts won't say out loud. Greenland isn't some empty canvas for America to redraw. It's home to 56,000 people. People with names, languages, memories, trauma. People who've already spent a century under one empire and aren't exactly lining up for another. Their message? Crystal clear. They don't want to be Danish. They don't want to be American. They want to be themselves. But small nations don't get to make clean exits. Not in a world where power sees land, not lives. So Greenland's independence dream? It becomes a chip on the poker table. A lever to pressure Copenhagen, maybe. But at what cost? Because here's the trap. Even if Washington plays the hero, promising support and freedom, that road leads to nowhere good. Greenland will never become a U.S. state, not with 56,000 people and no political clout, but it's also too strategic, too military critical to be let go. So what's left? Territorial limbo, a purgatory where Greenlanders follow American laws, but don't get the vote, where they carry obligations but hold no power, no senators, no presidential ballot, just a cold seat at a table where they're spoken for, not spoken to. And if you think goodwill will hold that together, let me introduce you to reality. The moment U.S. mining projects clash with Inuit lands or defense bases bulldoze ancestral grounds, it won't be quiet. It'll be lawsuits, blockades, civil disobedience, and yes, federal security shipped in to restore order. That's how modern colonialism works. Not with bayonets, but with bureaucracy. Not tanks, but tear gas. And while the fallout brews in Greenland, the real damage hits Washington. Because when the so-called land of the free turns a nation's self-rule into a federal management file, it burns the very credibility that made America different from every empire that came before. You think China or Russia won't weaponize that? They'll plaster it on billboards. America, just another colonial power with better branding. And here's the part that keeps me up at night. This deal doesn't just risk money, minerals, or military alliances. It risks the soul of the idea, this fragile belief that America could lead without owning, that power could be earned, not extracted. We've already seen how this ends. Puerto Rico, over 3 million people, American citizens who can't vote for their own president, no real say in Congress, and after a $70 billion debt crisis, they were placed under direct financial control by Washington, like children too irresponsible to manage their own lives. Now, zoom out to Greenland, tiny, remote, and even more dependent. If Puerto Rico couldn't escape second-class citizenship after a century, what makes anyone think Greenland will be treated better? And that's the final irony. In trying to absorb Greenland, America may just absorb something else, the colonial instincts it swore it had outgrown. Because this isn't just about where Greenland is going, it's about what kind of country America is becoming. When I look at the story of Greenland, I don't see a deal. I see a test of whether great powers still understand the difference between strength and wisdom. History follows a cruel pattern. The moment an empire reaches its peak, it starts to believe the world is for sale, that borders are lines on a balance sheet, that people are assets to be managed, and that's when it starts to rot. From the inside, Greenland exposes that illusion with brutal clarity. On paper, it looks like a strategic jackpot. Minerals, military positioning, Arctic leverage. But underneath, it's a fragile society, a brutal landscape, a colonial scar that never healed. When a superpower enters that space with the mindset of a landlord and the arrogance of an empire, it doesn't create order. It manufactures chaos. And what haunts me is not the risk that America loses money, or even that NATO fractures. What haunts me is this: a world where sovereignty becomes negotiable, and small nations become bargaining chips. That's not a stable world, not for anyone. But there's always another path. Power that lasts doesn't come from occupation. It comes from invitation, from trust, from alliances built on dignity, not dominance. Cooperation creates allies. Colonialism creates blowback. In this story, Greenland is not the prize, it's the mirror. And it reflects the deeper question this century is asking every superpower. Will you be a guardian in a world ruled by laws? Or an empire in a world ruled by force? Because here's the truth most empires forget, right before they fall. Maps don't make you strong. Legitimacy does. If this story makes you uncomfortable, I'm good. That's the reflex of a conscience still alive. Because the future of this planet won't be shaped by who owns more land, but by who still respects the right of people to decide who they are. If you found value in this, obliterate that like button. Hit subscribe. Ring the bell so you don't miss the next collapse we dissect. And drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. I'm Kamran, and I'll see you in the next video.